I must apologise for the technical difficulties here, but it's an absolute pleasure to be back in Oxford. And this will be a paper about slightly about genealogies as well. Now, I realise I have left the quotations in German, so the most important thing, I suppose, for this paper is this opening quotation. This is von Heinrich Voss, classicist translator. He's noted in the catalogue as well. Das heiße einen Saustall einem Palast vergleichen. So comparing Homer to the Nibelungenlied is like comparing a pigsty to a palace. And I don't think he's unfortunately referring to the Nibelungenlied as a palace in this context. So I've changed the title because Voss comes out with this remarkable quotation. This gives us a flavour of some of the polemical qualities of the tussles that we see if we look at Heidelberg at the turn of the 19th century. And I want to focus on Heidelberg in particular because it's a place where we see a real clash between classicist and romantic positions. Now, the comparison between the Nibelungenlied and the Homeric epic may not ordinarily assume a major role in scholarly narratives when we look at Heidelberg in this period. In fact, it very much is a sort of side role. But I wanted to use this quotation here to really get into some further issues. So Heidelberg is famously attractive for romantic writers in particular and scholars who had historical and medieval interests. When Goethe visited Heidelberg, he notes the medieval centre that is Heidelberg in scholarship. And this is in part aided by the re-establishment of its university in 1803. And the debates between classicists and romantics really started very, very early on. Most famously, when we look at Heidelberg in the Romantic period, we have Clemens Brentano and Achim von Arnim, who then were there from 1805 onwards. They had this Knaben Wunderhorn project. They were interested in collecting folk songs. It's also a location where we have appreciable fluidity between scholarly philology, at times associated with this university, but also literary practices. And if I'm to indulge in a moment of counterfactual literary history, there's one outstanding figure who never made it to Heidelberg, to the university, and that's Ludwig Tieck, who was considered for a professorship of aesthetics, but withdrew his name from consideration. Tieck's work on the Nibelungenlied remains stubbornly unpublished during his lifetime, despite the entreaties from his publisher, increasingly desperate entreaties. And if we do look at Tieck in the context of the Nibelungenlied reception, we do still have two archaizing poems, two romanzen on the material, which I understand were important for Wagner. But my point of departure today is not Tieck, but to turn back then to Voss from the quotation in the title. And I'm interested in how the Romantics run up against Voss, who was perhaps their most well-known polemical foe. Voss, whose two-volume Anti-Symbolik from the 1820s was a fierce attack on the magnum opus of Friedrich Kreutzer, the Symbolik. Kreutzer was a professor of comparative mythology at the university. But I'd like to argue that it's not just about Kreutzer. Voss made a name for himself as a translator of Homer into German in the 1780s. He translated Homer into hexameters that make for a really interesting foreignizing translation. It was appreciated as a landmark well into the 19th century. Achim von Arnim, who otherwise isn't particularly friendly towards Voss, will still recommend it for those interested in Homeric epic. Voss is also well known for Louisa and Idyll in classical hexameters from 1795. Now, when we get into the turn of the 19th century, Voss is often cast in scholarship in the role of a rather irritable and obsolescent figure, a relic of late Enlightenment thinking, left adrift in an age of increasingly febrile literary and political nationalism, particularly from around 1806 onwards. I'd like to suggest that Voss is an intriguing figure because of how he acts as a prism through which to illuminate differing political, in part religious, and literary priorities across the turn of the 19th century. Not just between the classicist and romantic camps, but also in terms of the reception of Homer and how that is necessarily connected to the reception of the Nibelungenlied. So I'll proceed today by looking at the elevation of the Nibelungenlied as an epic comparable to, perhaps even greater than Homer, from Friedrich August Wolff to Ludwig Tieck and to August Wilhelm Schlegel. We've already had Schlegel's Berlin lectures noted, and I'll come on to those. As the second step, I'll outline the position of the Nibelungenlied in Heidelberg Romanticism, and then, as a third step, I'll return back to Voss, accounting for why he must reject the comparison between the Nibelungenlied and Homeric epic, despite the fact that in his younger years he was part of what's called the Göttinger Hainbund, which was a sort of collective of writers who were actually interested in nationally informed cultural recovery projects. So there's something interesting going on generationally with Voss. The moment I'd like to immediately focus on falls on the cusp of the conventional turn we find towards literary nationalism, that is, at this moment of the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. And I'd like to, therefore, just briefly give a bit more context to the quotation from the title, because in early 1805, this is when we find Voss dismissing any comparison between Homeric epic and the Nibelungenlied, in a report offered by Clemens Brentano to Achim von Arnim. And I'll give it in German, but then briefly give sense in the English. Voss soll sich sehr hart gegen dich bei der Caroline Rudolphi über dich ausgelassen haben. That's a correct repetition there. Weil diese ihm erzählte, auch du habest von den Nibelungen gesagt. Sie konnten uns gewissermaßen was den Griechen der Homer sein. Er sagte unter anderem, das heiße einen Saustall, einen Palast vergleichen. So Achim von Arnim, one of the primary figures of Heidelberg Romanticism, has said that Nibelungenlied is to the Germanic nation, or to the German nation, what Homer is to the Greeks. And as far as Voss is concerned, the Nibelungenlied is the pigsty to the palace of Homer. There may also be an Odyssey reference going on here in this quotation. Now, Clemens Brentano is very much a biased messenger. He packages this piece of literary gossip in a joke at Voss's expense. He's poking fun, actually, in this letter at Voss's inability to understand Goethe's poetry. Nonetheless, Voss's blank refusal to attribute any aesthetic qualities to the Nibelungenlied, also maybe any aesthetic completeness, if we take the sort of constructive metaphor here seriously, it's far from unreflected anti-romanticism and happens to be consistent with his understanding of Homer too, which is a point to which I will return. Whilst the notion of labelling the Nibelungenlied a German Iliad has a much longer genealogy, as we've heard, concentrated interest in the Lied began in earnest in the first decade of the 19th century, with increasing discussion and publication of excerpts in German periodicals from around 1805 onwards. And in scholarly context, we also have the edition by Friedrich Heinrich von der Hagen in 1807. And particularly influential, as we've already heard, in elevating the status of the poem was Friedrich August Wilhelm Schlegel and his Berlin lecture series. Schlegel's important because he, indeed like many others, applied the principles of Friedrich August Wolff's 1795 Prolegomena ad Homerum to the Nibelungenlied. Wolff was very, very important for the Romantics in general, and Schlegel, therefore, is drawing on a general trend. I'd just like to talk about Tieck and Wolff before going to Schlegel. So when Ludwig Tieck is briefly discussing the Nibelungenlied in his Minnerlieder aus dem schwäbischen Zeitalter from 1803, Tieck focuses on the futility of identifying a single author or source of the Nibelungenlied. It is a text instead that has been continually copied. And what's important here is immediately the comparison with with Homeric epic, that it is as foolish to ask for a single author just as it is to ask for a single author of Homeric epic. So there's a sort of trace of Friedrich August Wolff going on here. But this position, the idea that there is no single Homer, is completely unacceptable for Voss, who remained consistent in his Unitarian take on Homer. Where Tieck's Wolffian comparison is but a staging post in his argument, August Wilhelm Schlegel's lecture series proceeds more methodically, whilst also carefully adopting a critical approach towards the exemplarity and cultural deference towards Homeric epic. And I've got a longer quotation here. If I just move these, can I move these out of the way, Henrike? I'm not a Mac user, so I have no idea how to do it. Can I drag that there? Perfect. Okay. So hier vom August Wilhelm Schlegel. In dem geflügelten Wohllaut der Sprache und des Versbaues sind die in sich so lieblich an alle Dinge und ihre Eigenschaften anschmiegenden Benennungen, auch in der Ruhe und Besonnenheit der Reinheit der epischen Form, ist Homer unerreichbar. So he's listing the qualities that make Homer exemplary, and there's no way anyone else could reach the level of quality of the work. Was aber Lebendigkeit und Gegenwart der Darstellung, dann die Größe der Leidenschaften, Charaktere und der ganzen Handlung betrifft, darf sich das Lied der Nibelungen kühnlich mit der Ilias messen. Ich würde sagen, es tut es hier zuvor, wenn man es sich nicht zum Gesetz machen müsste, nie ein Meisterwerk auf Unkosten des anderen zu loben. So, okay, we have Homer is unreachable in some sense, but then he attributes various qualities to the Nibelungenlied that are equivalent with the Iliad, so this moment of identifying it as national epic. But then I'm particularly intrigued by the cautious formality at the end of this quotation. Schlegel's claim here is about making space for the Nibelungenlied as an exemplary epic. He's also probing that this idea of having this idea that we must necessarily that it actually does exceed Homer in some ways, and that there's a certain culture of deference towards Homer that we have to be cautious about. So Schlegel's here in quite cautious language probing at the tradition of hierarchy and deference towards Homer. Much as the elevation of the Nibelungenlied was attractive to the aesthetic program of Romanticism in general, and also to Heidelberg Romanticism, it does not occupy a central or really canonical role in the work of recovering Volkspoesie, which Heidelberg Romanticism is most famous for. But the Nibelungenlied is the subject of discussion in the short-lived organ for Heidelberg Romanticism in the Zeitung für Einsiedler. But what is actually consistent with the Heidelberg Romantics' take on the Nibelungenlied is anything that any way they approach the text, they are deeply, deeply dissatisfied with. Achim von Arnim wrote to Tieck exhorting him to finally publish his version of the Nibelungenlied because Hagen's 1807 edition was allegedly too dull for him. Equally, and I'll come on to Josef Görres in a moment, Arnim, who published Josef Görres' four-part essay on the Nibelungenlied, well, he thought that essay was far too unwieldy. It was neither sufficiently literary to be literary or not at all scholarly enough to be considered scholarly. It was a sort of fell between both camps. So Heidelberg Romanticism is interesting because we see the elevation, a rhetorical elevation of the Nibelungenlied thanks to various actors. But at the same time, its canonical status was far from assured. It was a text that was subject to, at times, idiosyncratic interpretation. And I'd like to turn briefly to Josef Görres here as an example of idiosyncratic interpretation. Like Voss, Görres often cuts a rather eccentric figure in the period. His literary and political career is sufficiently variegated to resist simple classification. Particularly in his time in Heidelberg between 1805 and 1808, the articles he produced for various romantic periodicals have been characterized by George S. Williamson as, I quote, combining historical erudition with the drunken gaze of a mystic. Certainly, there's also a scholarly impulse animating Görres' work. In the paratext to his collection of German Volksbücher from 1807, he follows Wolffian lines of argument by looking at how Trojan myths and a culture of oral transmission were historically superseded by the fixity of the written word in Homeric epic. That is, for Görres, distinct from the Romantic project of the folk perceiving a refractive version of itself in the material of the Volksbücher and in the material of poetry. For Görres, work on popularizing and disseminating the Nibelungenlied is bound up with his broader interest in mythic traditions. We've already had ideas of comparative myth come up, and I'd just like to stay with this, because there's a real interest in the origin of myth. In a certain sense, this interest in myth, which Görres shared with Friedrich Kreutzer, is something of an extension of the 18th century fascination with narratives of cultural origin, the origin of the human race and world histories. as well. And here there's a certain lineage we can trace back to Herder as one of these sort of important influences. In particular, Görres and Kreutzer were driven to Indian and Indic myth, and much as Görres also duly acknowledges the overlaps between the Edda and the Nibelungenlied in his work. But Görres is sort of pulled towards out of the East origin narratives. He points in his essay to family resemblances between Persian mythology, such as Ferdowsi's 10th century Shahnameh, and the Nibelungenlied. He likes to assert a rather diffuse origin for elements of this material, so maybe we can return to this idea of epic convergence. And so Görres is interesting because his argument is universalizing, syncretizing. He's trying to account for the dissemination of myth, but he's also specific in locating the Nibelungenlied as a distinct expression of the Germanic peoples and the Germanic language during the migration period. This is something that Voss then renders in rather heady and naturalizing metaphors. I'll try to keep the quotation as short as possible. It is rather dense. Germanen und Hunnen, Stahl und Kiesel, im dunklen, glühenden Funken sprühte das schlafende Feuer auf und schlug frei geworden seine tönenden Kreise durch die Lüfte durch. So wurde gewaltsam der innere Geist entkettert und in den leichten, schwebenden Gesang gefasst. So this is the spirit, as it were, of the Germanen und Hunnen being unleashed and then taking shape in the songs of the Nibelungenlied. And what became the Nibelungen, I should say. In diesen Badenliedern müssen wir die zweite Quelle der Nibelungen anerkennen, wie wir die innerste Ader tief im Osten aufgesucht. So he's trying to do two things here. He's sort of claiming a certain bardic Badenlieder as an origin for the Nibelungenlied, but he also wants to have an out of the East narrative as well for some of the sources of the material. Deutschland, wie es damals tief hinunter nach Spanien, Gallien und Italien, selbst Afrika gereicht und hinauf nach Britannien und Skandinavien, all das weite Gebiet durch das Band einer Muttersprache verknüpft, war das Feld, auf dem die Stürme um die Anfang des neuen Erdenjahrs gegeneinander sich versuchten. Wie Pilger zogen in ihm nach allen Richtungen die Nationen auf Kampf und Schlachten aus, unter ihren Tritter bersteten die Adern der Erde, sie blutete in 1000 kleinen Springquellen auf und darauf sammelte sich später erst der schöne, große Strom das Epos. Der Mittelpunkt seines Lebens kann nur in der Mitte seiner Geschichte liegen. So there seems to be a sort of topographical metaphor going on here that we have, and also this naturalizing idea of the sort of the earth giving rise to the Nibelungenlied, but specifically then in this Germanic context. Görres' rather dense account, and those who read German here will see that it certainly isn't particularly scholarly at this moment, with its gesture towards out of the East notions of mythic origins, may prefigure his later Mythengeschichte der asiatischen Welt, the history of myth of the Asian world. And he is keen to draw a distinction between the fall of Latin and Greek literature with the demise of the Roman Empire, in contrast to the vitality of nationale poesie, of national poetry. And for that reason, there's no explicit recourse to Homer here. Görres is certainly an idiosyncratic figure here, but what we can see, at least in his approach, are the contours of a national or nationalistic appropriation of the Nibelungenlied, and this is very common for its romantic reception. So the romantic take on the Nibelungenlied operates by analogy with the developments in philological work on Homeric epic, but also seeks to make space for that which is distinctly national or Germanic in origin, necessitating in part the containment of its Norse variants as derivations, not as a point of origin. Now, I'd like to return to Voss now to answer the question of why he would dismiss the Nibelungenlied outright. There are partly interpersonal reasons for this. Voss in Heidelberg was very much excluded from romantic circles. There are also religious reasons. The Catholicizing strains within Romanticism are well known to be anathema to Voss's Lutheranism, not least because he somewhat wildly, in his anti-symbolic, insinuated the existence of a papal conspiracy that was animating the Romantics, one designed to lead to political regression. Voss himself is politically interesting because he had broadly progressive and, one might say, democratic sensibilities. Whilst such assertions are part and parcel of Foss's no-holds-barred polemicising, there is equally a serious scholarly point behind his anti-symbolic, and ones that really are in some ways at variance with his earlier literary career, which I've made reference to. His own translation of Homer from the 1780s, and then I think it's in the turn of the 19th century where he completes it, was conceived as of a way of sort of emancipating German literary language and German literature from Francophone models. So there is a national impulse behind Voss to some extent. So, to return to this idea of Voss's rejection of the Nibelungenlied being inextricably linked to his position of Homer, Voss himself helpfully gives us the link. His attack on Friedrich Kreuz's comparative mythology, so the Heidelberg comparative mythologist, are a continuation of earlier disputes within classical antiquarianism and philology. Voss had previously rejected Christian Gottlob Heine's comparative and symbolic approach to interpreting the classical world. That's something that Kreutzer then take up, so that's certainly something that Voss can't agree with. At the same time, the genetic link with the Nibelungenlied stems from a disagreement with Friedrich August Wolff's work. Wolff had himself been well aware that Voss would disagree with his thesis that Homer could not be associated with a single author. So Voss, in his anti-symbolic, refers to the Wolffian Viel-Homer or Flick-Homer, so the sort of many-headed Homer, or the Homer that's been stitched together out of pieces. And in his anti-symbolic, Voss mounts a very careful defense of Homer as the single author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a Unitarian position about the aesthetic unity and completeness of each work, which acts to protect them against being subsumed into syncretizing and, in Voss's mind, far too associative accounts of texts that make use of myth and develop from oral traditions. Voss probably fears that someone like Giles might snap onto Homer and do something with that. Voss's refusal to move on the question of a single authorship, it becomes really something of an article of faith. But it also means that the Nibelungenlied can really be nothing more than a pigsty compared to a Homeric palace. To give any credence to the Nibelungenlied necessarily would mean giving credence to Wolff's groundbreaking interpretation of Homer. So I hope I haven't gone over time too much. I'd just like to conclude briefly by just emphasising the porosity of literary and scholarly approaches to both Homeric epic and the Nibelungenlied at the turn of the 19th century. Both forms of epic allow for writers and critics to adopt distinct positions regarding questions of authorship, but also questions about how traditions, national or not, can be constructed, even transnational traditions, comparative traditions, and that sort of thing. Thank you very much for your attention.
I just have to switch over back to not mirroring, stop mirroring, great. And here, great, now share screen. Sorry, I'm just talking to myself to get things properly set up. That should be it. Everybody should be able to see you now, and you move forward this and go back. If you come round, sorry. Come round this way.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This paper will be very much about a reading of the Nibelungenlied rather than reception, but I hope you will bear with me because the topic that I'm talking about is one that has surprisingly not been investigated very much. When the Nibelungenlied was first rediscovered in modern times, commentators noted the discrepancy between the style of the language and the manners portrayed on the one hand, and the heroic themes and the characters on the other, which date from many centuries previously. And commentators in modern times have had much to say about heroism, chivalry, conquest, but the actual nature of combat has received comparatively little attention. And this is surprising considering how much of the poem is about fighting. In Aventura 4, the Burgundians draw on Siegfried's warlike qualities to defeat an invasion of Saxons and Danes led by the kings Ludeger and Ludegast. But other instances of combat are very different. In the second half of the poem, fighting between the Burgundians and their Hunnish hosts breaks out in Aventura 32 and continues until the deaths of Gunther and Hagen in 39. So combat in one form or other features in a quarter of the Aventuren of the poem. So in this paper, I want to examine the nature of fighting, and I will be arguing that the epic shows two very distinct styles, one relating to the society with which its audiences would have been familiar, and another deriving from the ancient heroic societies in which its key narratives originated. I should stress that I am a historian of medieval Europe. I don't know very much about Homer, but I will try and bring him in towards the end. At the time that the Nibelungenlied was written down, warfare in Germany, as in most of Western Europe, was dominated by knights fighting on horseback, armed with lance and sword, and protected by a mail hauberk, a shield, and the encompassing great helm, as shown in this illustration of the Battle of Bouvines, fought between Emperor Otto IV and King Philip II of France in 1215. Territorial princes such as the Duke of Bavaria or the Archbishop of Cologne maintained retinues each of several hundred knights, most of them unfree ministeriales, who provided permanent military forces for themselves and for the service they owed to the emperors. Now, mounted warriors were nothing new at this time, but their importance was derived from changes in warfare occurring at the end of the 11th century. Up to that point, the spear tended to be held by warriors at the midpoint of the shaft and wielded overarm in a stabbing function, such as we see in the Bayeux embroidery dating from around 1080. A major shift in tactics occurred around the year 1100 when knights developed a new technique in which the spear was tucked under the right arm and aimed at an enemy's torso as the charge hit home. This tactical change increased the reach of the weapon, but more importantly, it enabled the knight to harness the speed and weight of his horse by concentrating these forces into the point of the spear. And so, in the course of the 12th century, spears became thicker and were given protection for the hand in the form of a guard known as a vamplate. And it's conventional in English to refer to this heavier weapon as a lance. English is the only language that seems to make this distinction. In German, in Middle High German, speer is used for both types of weapon. So the key battlefield tactic employed units of knights several lines deep who rode in close formation, really knee to knee, so that the impact of the entire group was delivered simultaneously. Speed had to be controlled to prevent the formation breaking up and to avoid tiring out the horses. So normally the enemy would be approached at the trot and only the last 40 to 50 metres would be carried out at a gallop. A charge performed well had a good chance of breaking through or dispersing an enemy formation and could secure a great initial advantage in any combat. If delivered well, the initial charge with the lance could prove decisive, but more often broken lances would be cast away and fighting would continue with swords. So this tactic called for considerable discipline and practice in order to maintain the close formation in which knights would ride. The Nibelungenlied gives us an example of a manoeuvre known as the Kehre, or the Wiederkehre, in which Siegfried breaks through the enemy formations 3 times, but turns around and returns back to join his own men before launching another charge. By the year 1200, it was not enough for knights to rely on individual courage and horsemanship. They had to practice the charge as well as regrouping and falling back into close formation. Maybe I can tell you about the time I almost became a TV star in medieval studies. About 10 years ago, I was approached by a television company who told me they were making a series about how to become a knight. And they wanted me to advise them. It was a program that was going to be week by week. And each week there was going to be a different activity, riding, using swords, how to dance in a courtly manner, and so on. And I thought, oh, well, here I'm going to be up with the Mary Beards of medieval history. But then I asked more and more about how this was going to operate. And they wanted young men of student age to compete in a kind of virtual reality program in which each week they would all be tested on their ability, and one would be tracked out, and then week by week they would move on until we had a winner. And I said, well, of course, you do realise they need to start training at the age of 8. Now, this did not fit into their concept, so I was dropped like a hot potato, and that's why you don't see me on TV these days. Training was key to all this, and training is also key to the importance of tournaments. Originally a kind of mass combat known in Middle High German as a Turnai, these practiced the kind of manoeuvres required in battle. A knight had to ride holding a shield in his left arm, wielding a lance or a sword in his right. The left hand also had to hold the reins, which meant that he had to control the horse essentially with spurs and knees. This is not something that you could learn in a matter of weeks. And many of these skills were acquired through participation in a kind of intermediate form of tournament called the Buhurt, known in Germany from the mid-12th century. It seems to have involved riding in formation in the same manner as the tourney, but it was far less warlike in character. So participants did not wear helmets or body armour, but they carried shields. And one of the actions involved was using these shields to push back against opponents. So in the Nibelungenlied, the character of the Buhurt seems to be closer to the much newer tournament form of jousting, which was a form of tournament in which pairs of knights would compete to unhorse each other or simply to break lances. So in jousting, the lances did not have the sharp tips employed in warfare, but had a three-pronged lance head known as a coronal, which meant that the lance would break more easily. So while the original function of the Buhurt was to provide training and exercise in formation, the character of Buhurt and also jousting, as being much less dangerous than the tourney, meant that they were both associated with joyful events such as weddings, knighting ceremonies, and so on. And we can see there are 5 instances of Buhurt and jousting that occur in the Nibelungenlied. The last example is all the more significant because this is where Volker von Altzey purposely goes out to kill one of the Hunnish participants. He was violating what was intended to be a peaceful and celebratory occasion. And this dramatic episode helps to heighten the latent animosity between the two parties and moves the action towards outright violence between them. It's interesting that in the Hundeshagen manuscript, the only one with illustrations, the Buhurt is actually envisaged as a kind of 15th century joust with the total protective armour that had been developed by this time that meant it was almost impossible to sustain serious injury at this point. Right, that's my rather longish introduction. How does this play out in the Nibelungenlied? Well, the most extended description of this contemporary form of knightly warfare occurs in Aventure 4, in which Siegfried and his companions from the Netherlands lead the Burgundians in repelling the invasion by Ludeger of Saxony and Ludegast of Denmark. Yet even here, there was scope for individualism. Knights could enhance their reputation for deeds of valour by riding ahead of the tight formations in order to seek out and do battle with high-status opponents. Now, this was not only risky in personal terms, but it also threatened the good discipline required, and so was often clamped down upon by commanders. In literary texts, of course, these reservations did not apply, and if you're a Siegfried, you can basically do what you want, and this is what we find happening. So here, Siegfried is reconnoitering the terrain ahead when he spies King Ludegast, and both men immediately charge each other with lances. But even though this is a single combat, what the poem describes here contains the essential features of warfare as practiced in contemporary wars and tournaments. The initial charge with lances, when these are broken, the combat continues with swords, with both men turning and wheeling their horses in order to approach their opponents to the best advantage, until one of them is forced to yield. But this is only the initial engagement. Very soon, 30 of Ludegast's warriors arrive. This is a typical size for a unit of knights around the year 1200. They charge together, only for all but one of them to be cut down by Siegfried. And battle continues as the main forces arrive on the scene, moving in formations against each other. Although these formations are always described variously in translations as retinues or columns or divisions, the normal word in Middle High German is Schar, denoting a unit of 20 to 50 knights, which was strong enough to fight on its own, but small enough to be manoeuvrable. So after the initial clash, the opposing forces engage in the pushing and striking with swords of a melee, as you can see in this quotation. Soon after this point in the poem, the poet tells us that many men dismounted and fought on foot, throwing spears and javelins. Now, this is very, very strange. In the 12th and 13th centuries, knights would rarely dismount voluntarily. It would place them in a more vulnerable position and deprive them of their best means of escape. And for a knight to lose his horse was a matter of honour. It put him on the same status as a less honourable foot soldier. So I think what we are seeing described in the poem is a fusion between the normal practice of warfare around 1200 and an older, remembered feature of heroic combat deriving from the epic's source materials. You will also notice the word ger. Now, ger is a word which is probably known to every adult German today, because it seems to feature in almost every crossword puzzle appearing in tabloids and magazines such as Bunte and Stern and so on, invariably with the clue Germanischer Wurfspieß. But whether it would have been recognised by 13th century audiences is questionable, since by that time it was not part of a knight's armoury. The word ger referred to a type of javelin or throwing spear used by ancient Germanic warriors, as well as by the Celts and the Greeks, and even initially by Roman armies. But it was used on foot and was primarily for throwing at an opponent rather than stabbing, which would have required a longer spear. The ger features in the most extended descriptions of combat, that is the fighting between Huns and Burgundians in Hungary that occupies most of Aventuren 31 to 39. This takes place in and around the halls of Etzel's capital, so of necessity it describes fighting on foot. But the characteristics of the numerous combats described relate to an age far earlier than the chivalric combat familiar to the Nibelungenlied's audiences. A typical example occurs in Aventura 35, when Margrave Eyring of Denmark enters the hall, followed by a retinue of 1,000 men in order to attack the Burgundian guests. Despite leading a large number of warriors, Eighteenth goes forward alone in order to combat Hagen. Both men throw their javelins at each other, which penetrate their shields, whereupon they draw their swords. Eighteenth fights in turn with Hagen, Volker, Gunther, Gernot and Giselher. He is knocked to the ground, but he's still unscathed and returns to his followers. He and Hagen then rearm with javelins and resume the fight, in which Eighteenth is wounded by a sword stroke. Hagen then picks up a javelin from the floor and throws it, hitting Eighteenth in the head, which gives him a death blow. This sequence of combat on foot, with the combatants throwing javelins and then fighting with swords, is quite anachronistic for the time of composition. Rather, it goes back to forms of warfare common to ancient Germanic and Celtic peoples before the Goths and others adapted to mounted warfare, probably following the example of the Huns. The ancient Germanic tradition of fighting on foot survived in England until 1066, when the Anglo-Saxon thanes and housecarls rode to battle, but then took up defensive positions on foot at Senlac Hill, while the Normans and their allies repeatedly made mounted charges in the more modern chivalric form. I should also state that I think the fighting in these final Aventuren has an almost cinematic quality. Although there are supposedly thousands of knights on each side, most of the action is portrayed as a series of single combats between named high-status individuals who have greater social status and prominence than the anonymous masses around them. And of course, in modern films about the ancient and medieval periods, martial action similarly tends to focus on the very well-known heroes and villains, who are of course played by the more famous actors, who end up fighting each other, while the ordinary warriors on both sides are usually faded out into the background or shown as a mass formation rather than as individuals. I don't doubt that in reality, some commanders in the heroic age would actually try to attack prominent men on the other side in the hope of taking out a rival leader and thus dealing a blow to enemy morale. There may have also been cases where a champion strode out from the ranks before opposing forces met in order to challenge a warrior of similar status from the enemy. But given the confusion and the noise of battle, I do not believe it was realistic that warriors would invariably end up fighting against others of similar status. I think what we're looking at here is a literary trope. An obvious early example is the Old High German Hildebrandtslied, now thought to derive from a 7th century Lombardic original, which opens with the father and son, Hildebrand and Harubrand, between two armies, and the expectation of the poem is that the two champions will engage in single combat before any wider fighting breaks out. Although the two heroes have actually ridden to battle, the final lines of the poem show that they intend to dismount, to throw javelins, and then engage at close quarters with swords. We could go even further back and argue that the single combats in the final quarter of the Nibelungenlied echo much of the fighting involving the many named heroes of the Iliad. Here the typical pattern is of individual combat between a series of named heroes. Fighting begins with the throwing of javelins, and I was surprised to discover even with rocks on occasion, before the warriors engage at close quarters with a sword and shield. And both the style and the themes of the Greek and the Middle High German epics embody features of an ancient form of fighting on foot with throwing spears and swords, and also reflect the importance of single combats. Even though it contains numerous references to the terminology, usages and fighting techniques of knightly warfare, I think that the Nibelungenlied preserves a greater number of relics of a form of combat which had a long tradition stretching back many centuries to the ancient European past. This form of fighting would scarcely have been recognised by the free knights and ministeriales who must have heard it recited, although they would have undoubtedly been able to appreciate the courage and resourcefulness of the warriors described in it. We might regard Siegfried's sword, known by the name Balmung, as a signifier of this older form of warfare. The fame of Balmung has reached Worms before Siegfried arrives there, for Hagen already knows how he took the sword from the Nibelungen horde in the far north. After killing Siegfried, Hagen takes Balmung and later wields it in defence of his kinsmen against the Hun. But poetic justice sees to it that once he has been overpowered by Dietrich von Bern, he is killed with it by Kriemhild. The sword Balmung thus not only provides an element which ties together both halves of the poem, but it's also significant as being the only named non-human object in the entire work. Named swords, often with magical or talismanic qualities, are common to heroic poetry, but they are absent from the more recent chivalric romance. And it's a reflection of the changing nature of arms and the man, as well as animals, that in Wolfram's Parsifal there are no named swords. However, there are at least 3 named horses that play an important part in the action. So this change from the Nibelungenlied to the warfare shown in Parsifal is a reflection of the importance of a newer form of warfare which featured the horse as well as the new cult of chivalry that grew up around it. Tempora mutantur et bella in illis.